Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. And I'm really happy to be here sharing this event, which is part of the Festival of Ideas, your Festival of Ideas. So, and tonight we are having an amazing conversation with Joseph Zarate. Joseph Zarate is the author of the Wars of the Interiors, or Guerras del Interior in Spanish. He's from Peru. And but before I introduce Joseph, I will introduce myself. I am Rosa Hernandez. I work for the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York. And Joseph Zarate is, as I mentioned before, he is the author of Wars of the Interior. He's a journalist and he received the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Award in 2018 and the Ortega and Gasset Prize in 2016. He has served as a deputy editor of the magazine Etiqueta Verde and Etiqueta Negra, and he was awarded in 2018 the Oakper Fellowship by the Dart Center of Journalism and Trauma of the School of Journalism at Columbia University in New York. So Wars of the Interior was named one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times in Spanish, Forbes Mexico, and the Deutsche Welle. So thank you, Joseph, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Rosa, for this introduction. It's a pleasure for me to talk with you. So thank you so much for the invitation for this festival. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I was really excited when I heard the invitation as well, because we are both from Latin America. I'm from Mexico, and I'm so happy. I was really happy reading your book and understanding about the complex situation and the struggles that people are living in your country, in Peru. So could you talk a bit more about the regions that Peru is divided in, please? Because when we talk about Peru, most of people in Latin America, we think immediately about the Andes, but we don't realize that there are so many different regions and they have different characteristics. So could you describe a bit more for us, for the audience, please?
Yes, I'm gonna talk in Spanish to elaborate my ideas. Bueno, mi país es el Perú.
My country, Peru, is a very diverse country. Geographically, it's divided into different regions. Just to look at the example you used, people often think of Peru as a country made up of the Andes. We have the stories of the Incas and their empire, Tawantinsuyo. But if we actually look at the geographical makeup of Peru, we realize that almost 70% of the territory of Peru is made up of Amazon rainforest. So, if we look at it from that point of view, Peru is actually an Amazonian rainforest country. Yes, we have mountains and the coast, but it also has a huge area of jungle, and often Peruvians ourselves don't realize this, those of us who live in large cities. To give you an idea, there are 51 Amazonian nations in our rainforest, and each one of them has their own language, their own culture, their own worldview. So it's very interesting once we really understand that reality. We realize that within that country, that nation, there are many other nations coexisting. There's a similar situation in Mexico and other Latin American countries. We live in nations that have many nations within them that are trying to understand each other's point of view. Sometimes they aren't trying to do that, and sometimes people, especially politicians, people with power, try to impose their worldview and their perception of progress on these vulnerable communities. And that's what I try to look at in my book.
Hablar en mi libro, ¿no?
Wars of the Interiors, Guerras del Interior. If I show the book to the audience, maybe they can see it. I don't know. Yeah, I have it in Spanish as well. So I read it in Spanish and in English. So when you talk about, you describe 3 different conflicts, social problems that in 3 different regions in Peru. So you chose to talk about gold, well, wood, gold, oil. You chose to discuss land disputes, people who live and defend their territories. So what was the source of your inspiration to write about these topics? When did you start writing about these topics? I'm very curious about that.
Thank you for the question. Bueno,
Well, over the last 7 years in my career as a journalist, I've been writing a series of narrative reports, chronicles, relating to indigenous men and women who are fighting against large powers, powers that appear to be bigger than them, more powerful than them. These might be a mafia or multinational companies acting irresponsibly. They might even be the state itself. And these people are fighting these powers to defend what they consider to be their home. It could be a river, a valley, it could be a forest. So, as I was writing these stories for the magazine Etiqueta Negra, where I worked for many years, I started to realize that there was a common thread running through them, something linking them together. And I quickly realized that that common thread had to do, above all, with a fight for identity, but especially for what we as human beings understand progress to be. So as I was writing these, there came a point at the start of 2016 where I decided to bring all these stories together and publish them in a book. And as I was working on that project, I began to realize that there were patterns emerging. For example, there was a story on deforestation, a forest, another about gold mining, another about oil spills, and there were others. There were about 7 stories. But then, thinking about and analysing the material I'd written, I realised that wood, gold and oil are natural resources that are at the foundations of Latin American societies. If you recall a bit of history, when the Spanish conquistadors came to this part of the world, that time was mainly characterized by an all-consuming obsession for accumulating gold. And so think about it, gold mining is from the foundation of what we could today call Peruvian or Latin American society. The same thing happened in Mexico and other parts of the world, a complete obsession. And moving forward in time, we get to the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. We have the explosion of rubber as a commodity, which was used for tires for the cars of Europe and the United States. And there's a link there with the theme of wood, the exploitation of forest resources, the condition of practical slavery of thousands of indigenous people who died during that period. And then we move a bit further. We get to the 20th, 21st century, the oil industry. If you can imagine, from the statistics I was able to gather, and which I've included in the book, 84% of the oil extracted worldwide is used as fuel for our vehicles. And 16%, more or less, is used in the petrochemical industry to make the things that we consume on a day-to-day basis in supermarkets, everything. Yes. So each material is, in a way, connected with a period of Latin American history and Peruvian and world history as well, really. And so those were the criteria through which I chose those three materials, because in a certain way I felt they were already working as a metaphor for progress in the text, for how progress was understood at that time throughout human history. So I tried to make that link in the book, and that's why I ended up using those three materials. It's very interesting to look at humanity through that lens.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Sorry, my apologies for the audience, because sometimes it's difficult. I'm listening to you in Spanish, so but I will try to answer all the time in English, so it's difficult for me.
No, don't worry.
In these three metaphors that you are talking, that you are describing, which are wood, gold, and oil. So you have like three different characters in your books, in the three different chapters. So would you like to describe for us who Edwin Chota is? What does he represent in the Amazon, in the rainforest? What is the importance of talk about him in this context of Peru, which are, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well,
Edwin Chota is a person, or his is the story that starts the book I wrote, Wars of the Interior. And Edwin Chota was an activist, an environmental leader. He was a man born in the city of Pucallpa, a city in the Amazon. A man who liked to be very well dressed, in a shirt, well-ironed trousers. He liked dancing, he loved the Bee Gees music. A city guy, really. But one day he decided to move to the rainforest because in his youth he'd met the indigenous communities when he was in the military, and he felt a kind of connection with that place. So he decided to leave his family and go to the jungle. And since he was the only literate person in that community called Soweto, an Amazonian community very close to the Brazilian border, as he was the only one who could read and write, the community chose him as their leader. And there was also the fact he'd fallen in love with an Ashaninka woman. The Ashaninka nation is one of the 51 Amazonian nations that I mentioned exist in Peru. He falls in love with this woman, the people choose him as their leader, and he decides to stay there. He decides to become Ashaninka. So he wasn't born Ashaninka, he became Ashaninka. And that's something really important, because in Peruvian society, especially, but Latin American society as well, as you'll be aware, historically, the dominant classes, the dominant culture, has always considered the indigenous world as an inferior world, as being behind. There's a very strong structure of racism.
Yeah, the poor peasants, the poor farmers.
Exactly. So normally, nowadays, you'll have people with indigenous origins, but they'll try to hide that heritage. For example, my grandmother was born in an indigenous community in the middle of the 20th century, and years later she told me there came a point where she felt ashamed of that background. So indigenous origins are seen as an impediment, something you have to hide. But Edwin Chota, on the other hand, made the opposite journey. He decided to embrace that culture that wasn't originally his. And he became a Shaninka. And for 12 years of his life, he fought the mafias, the illegal loggers in that part of the rainforest. The illegal loggers who would practically enslave the women, rape them, swindle the community landholders, destroy the rainforest. So he fought to the point where, well, the authorities were ignoring him until he finally managed to get some government authorities to go and see what was happening in the place. And the illegal loggers said, no, we're not going to allow this. And one morning they ambushed Edwin Chota and his companions in a gorge in the rainforest, and they riddled them with bullets, with shotguns, the kind that they use to hunt animals in the rainforest, and they left their bodies at the edge of a ravine. And I tell that story. So from Edwin Chota's murder, I try to share who this man was, why he was able to embrace a culture that wasn't his, and even risk his life, give his life for that community. I try to answer that question. Why did this man do that? And what does that have to do with us, right, as readers?
¿Y qué tiene que ver eso con nosotros, ¿no? Como lectores?
Yeah, there's something that I read in this chapter about wood in your book, that the importance of the maps, like an instrument of power. You mentioned that. Why is that? Why is a map an instrument of power for the government or for the illegal logging? Or it could be an instrument of power for the indigenous communities as well. Why do you mention it like that?
Sí. En mi país,
yes, in my country at least, geographical information, i.e. maps or cartography, is very developed. But that information, normally coordinated by the government, by government institutions, right? Normally that information costs. It costs money. And those who normally have the money to access that information are the large businesses interested in concessions for exploiting the oil, the wood in certain parts of the country. So that cartographic information is an instrument of power, but that instrument of power usually is not in the hands of the indigenous groups, indigenous peoples. Rather, it's in the hands of those who have the most money, who are interested in exploiting that land. So that's really what I was trying to convey. So what's happening at the moment? Edwin Chota, for example, understood that power that maps bring. The indigenous peoples have lived there for generations. Centuries they've lived there. They know their territory. They know where it begins, where it ends, and it's demarcated by, let's say, the course of a river, a forest, a mountain. They know their territory. But it's not registered in a, shall we say, Western document, a map. And without that map, they can't claim legal rights to their lands. As in, they need to present their claim to the state for the titles, the legal rights to their lands. But they don't have those resources. They don't have drones, satellites, they don't have that information. So Edwin Chota knew that, and that's why part of his fight was insisting to the government and other organizations, NGOs, to be able to put together, draw up a map, right, of his community, so that from the creation of that map he could go to ask for, to demand the rights of his community. I put it in the book. Often, for these communities, the process for seeking the titles to their lands can take 20 years, 30 years, right, to be able to obtain the property rights to their lands. But on the other hand, if a company comes to request concessions for a part of the rainforest, it takes 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So it's much faster.
Do they pay a lot of money?
Yes, because there's a privilege. They have that privilege, and there's also a greater interest on the part of the Peruvian state in exploiting the natural resources of those territories, often forgetting that people live there. There are families there, there are children living there, and so on. Obviously, I'm not saying we're against making use of our natural resources, but we can't do that by trampling on the fundamental rights of the Peruvians who live there. Imagine, maybe, I don't know, in my city, in Lima, it turns out there's gold beneath a house. So they need to evict the owners without giving them anything in return. They ignore their rights. That would be all over the news. But when it happens in the jungle, for example, thousands of miles from the city, well, very often it doesn't reach the news. It's not of public interest.
Nobody knows what's happening in the jungle.
Exactly. So I think in that sense, Edwin Chota realized that drawing up a map of Soweto, the community, was important, and he achieved it. He achieved it. Now Soweto, thanks to the actions of Edwin Chota and the map that they were able to get drawn up, Soweto now have the rights to their lands, over 800 square kilometers of forest.
Oh, that's great news to know that. In the same chapter, you mentioned about laundering machine, logging. So what is that? What is laundering the wood or launder? You mentioned that several times in this same chapter.
Yes, when I talk about wood laundering, or the laundering of the money from illegal logging, I'm especially talking about wood produced commercially, the commercialization of that natural resource. According to the stats, about 80%, maybe a little more, of the wood that is exported from Peru is illegal. So, wood that's not being taxed, that is taken out of the country illicitly, that's what I'm referring to. So, obviously, tax avoidance is a crime in itself, but often the system for wood laundering is actually very complex. Often corrupt officials are involved, acting in collusion with the wood companies. For example, a company with a concession in a specific part of the rainforest may say, okay, we're going to log a certain quantity, say 100 trees here. But actually, they're logging those 100 trees, but at the same time, they're logging in another area that's not registered. And they add the wood that they've logged in that unregistered area to the rest and say, oh yes, this is all from the same area. And in that way, they're operating a sort of dirty business, often taking advantage of the indigenous communities. So that's what I was referring to. It's a very common practice. Think about it. Over 80% of the wood, over 80% of the wood exported from Peru is illegal. And that really says something. I said in the book, it's almost like the drugs trade. The collusion with officials, only that, of course, while drugs leads to addictions and it kills in a more visible way, and People are prosecuted and incarcerated for drugs trafficking. Nobody, at least in Peru, no one is in prison for logging trees, for wood trafficking. It's not important to those of us who live in the city.
Yeah, but they are destroying the selva, the jungle.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Joseph, it's really interesting. I could ask you more questions about the same chapter, but I think we need to move on to the next chapter, so which is gold, el oro. The main character in this chapter is Maxima Acuna, I think. So where do they live? Where does this family live? Where does the gold mines, where are they situated? Where are they located? In which regions? And and you mentioned that her fight is mainly against Yanacocha or something like that.
Yes. Maxima Acuna is a woman from Cajamarca. Cajamarca is one of the regions found in the north of Peru. It's a mountainous region. Maxima lives at an altitude of around 4,000 meters above sea level in the Andes, and she rears animals, works in agriculture, produces textiles, and for several years, we're talking almost 8, maybe almost 10 years, she has been resisting pressure from the Yanacocha mine. Yanacocha is a mining company, a gold mine, and it's one of the biggest, or at one point was one of the biggest gold mining companies in the world. So what happened? In the region where Maxima lives, the Yanacocha mine discovered that there was gold. There was gold deep underground. And opposite Maxima's house, I'm sure you'll have pictures you can see on the screen here, there's a lagoon. And Yanacocha wanted to turn that lagoon into a site for depositing waste materials from the mining process. So Maxima, living in the heart of that mining project, called the Conga Project, refused to leave her home for the company to do that. She didn't want to. They even offered her money, etc., but she refused. So the mining company began to pressure her. I talk about this in the story, the ways in which the mine was pressuring her. Bringing in the police, for example, bringing in hired security personnel to destroy her farm, to tear down her house, and to intimidate her, to make her fearful, so that she would leave. When I found out about this story a few years ago, around the start of 2015, I decided to get on a bus and travel to where Maxima lives. And I stayed with her 2 weeks. I lived with her for 2 weeks because I wanted to understand why this 40-something-year-old woman with grown-up children, why she didn't just go. Why she didn't accept the money they'd offered her and avoid the problems. Why she didn't go to the city as many others have done. I wanted to understand why, to understand her way of viewing the world. So I was with her 2 weeks. I helped her to look after the cows, to work the land. She slept on a couple of mattresses along with her husband in a cabin, and I basically slept at their side. She told me everything that had happened, and I witnessed. Nobody told me this. I witnessed how the mine would send 5, 6 times a day security guards to film, to take photos, to trespass on her land, keeping her under surveillance, right? And that creates a real pressure that makes you fearful. And I relate all this in the book to shine a light on this conflict and understand why Maxima had that connection with the land. And something that really caught my attention is that those of us living in big cities, London, Mexico City, Lima, we can care about, have some kind of connection with nature, respect nature, and so on. But the connection that Maxima had with the earth was much deeper. And for me, it was difficult to understand because I grew up in the city. I studied in the city. So I wanted to understand, and I think one of the aims of modern journalism is not just to expose, to inform, but to try and understand who we are as human beings, why we are a certain way, why we think the way we do. So I think a beautiful part of journalism is doing that work.
Was it difficult for you to get access to the family, to chat with them, to live with them for 2 weeks, as you said?
Fue difícil en principio convencer a Máxima de ir, ¿no?
At first, it was difficult to convince Maxima to let me go. I spent 2 or 3 months before I travelled approaching her family, asking to visit her. I didn't want to interview her over the phone. Many people at that time, 2014, 2015, were telling her story, but from Lima, talking to her over the phone. But I wanted to go, I wanted to see, I wanted to be there. So I was trying to convince her over a few months, and she would say to me, "Look, I've had enough of journalists. I'm fed up with reporters. They always come here, they ask me questions, and then they publish whatever they like. They publish things that aren't true." So I tried to establish a relationship of trust. I think that's very important in journalism, to have empathy, to understand where other people are coming from and build a relationship. There's a quote by Gay Talese, the great North American columnist, who said,
"Reporting is like dating." ¿No?
So reporting is like going out with someone. And there's a lot of sense in that, because when you're interested in somebody's life, you want to know how they see the world, what they like, what they don't like. You establish a relationship of trust. And that idea really underpins the journalism I try to carry out, the idea of building a relationship. So in the end, after 2 or 3 months, Maxima said yes. I sent her some examples of my work. Well, I sent them to her daughter, because Maxima can't read or write. So her daughter read her my stuff and they said yes. And so I was able to go, and I stayed in her house for that length of time. And it was hard, of course, because I didn't grow up in rural areas, but I was interested in living alongside her, in knowing her story more closely. I think that's important. A reporter has to go out and see and witness and talk to people and then come back and tell the story. I think that's something we have to do.
Yeah, I was reading in your book that you mentioned that you were giving voices to these people, the voice to these people. Or at the same time, I think you were listening to them. So you you were having the power to listen to them. So this is really important. When you were talking about understand the way that they live, in research, we do it as well. We establish rapport with the people that we are working with. So in order to get close to the families, close to the people we are working with as well.
Sí, sí, hay una cosa
Yes,
que a mí me
yes.
parece muy importante.
There's something that I think is really important. It's something I heard said some time ago by Svetlana Alexievich, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, author of that great book, Chernobyl Prayer. She said that reality isn't that which you capture on your voice recorder. You switch your recorder on, you hit the rec button, and you start to record or write things down in your notebook. Svetlana says that's not reality. Reality, she says, needs to be understood. It needs to be interpreted. So that resonated a lot with me, because when I interview Maxima or Edwin Chota or other individuals who feature in the book, what I try to do is not just record what they say to me, but rather have a conversation with them, have them reflect on their situation with me, reflect on what's happening to them at that time. There's a quote by Julio Ramón Ribeiro, the great Peruvian novelist, who said something like, when he writes, or when he wrote, because he's now passed away, that he was trying to record the psychological story of a human decision. Record the psychological story of a human decision. When I read that quote in one of his papers, I said, hey, that's what I want to do. I want to do that in my book. I want to understand what the interior world of these people is like and why they make these decisions. So that's kind of related with what I was just mentioning.
What about the last? I have I have so many questions about this gold topic as well, but we need to carry on with the third one. So the third one is about oil. So another important natural resource in your country. So you talk about Osman Kunyachi. Is that the name of the child? So this is the child covered in oil. You mentioned that. So he was. I just had. I had a look on YouTube and I saw some videos, some photos on Google as well. In Google. So who is Osman Kunyachi? Why was he really, important for the media at that time? He was the child in the news. It's called something like that.
Sí, en el año
Yes.
2016,
In 2016, around January 2016, there was an oil spill in my country, one of the worst, largest in the last decade. So, to give a bit of background, here in Peru, in the Peruvian jungle to the north of the country, there is a very long pipeline. It's like, if you can imagine an anaconda, a steel serpent, 800 kilometers long or more, that goes right across the whole rainforest to the coast and transports the oil that Peruvians use in the cities, especially. So that oil pipe passes through several communities, several villages, and one of those villages is an Awajún community. The Awajún are an Amazonian nation, another of those 51, an Awajún community called Nazareth. So in the section that passed through Nazareth, there was an oil slick. over 500,000 litres of oil were spilt into the river. I mean, that's like half an Olympic swimming pool, more or less. Yes, it spilt into the river, polluting the water, the fish, the farms, the valley. So when this happened, the company responsible for extracting oil in that region, Peru, in desperation, put out a call to the families in Nazareth to please come and help them clean up the oil from the river, scooping it up with buckets in plastic bottles. And in return for that labour, the oil company would pay them 150 soles, about £35 at the time. So that's 7 times more than they earn cultivating bananas on their farms. So a huge amount of money for that region. A large number of children heard that announcement, over 50 children from the community. And so they wanted to earn money too, and they went to scoop up the oil from the river with no protection whatsoever. One of those children is Osman Kunyachi, a boy who was 11 years old at the time, and he went with his younger brothers, his 8-year-old brother, I think, and another brother who was 4, to clean up the oil. And part of the evidence that there were children cleaning up oil was a photo I saw of Osman, which I'm sure you'll have seen online, where he's covered in oil, covered, his arms, his legs, with a bucket and a red t-shirt that says Peru. So there's no doubt what country it is. And I saw that photo and it really hit me. Obviously, initially, you're outraged. It makes you sad to see that. But then I wanted to know who this child was, because up to that point no one really knew his name, who he was, what had happened. So what I did was, again, get on a bus, travel one day to the jungle, to that area, and meet him. Meet him, meet his family, meet his friends, meet the other neighbours who'd gone to clean up the oil, the authorities, the Peru engineers. So I was in the area for about 3 months, more or less, over 3 visits. I interviewed around 63 people to build a picture of this story and to be able to understand how an ecological disaster such as this one could become a perverse form of progress. That is to say, the inhabitants of Nazareth realized that cleaning up the oil in that area was dangerous, could contaminate, but with that fear, despite that fear, they still went to work, and later some of them were contracted formally by Peru. But in a way, they did it because it was an option, a chance to earn money, to be able to provide food for their families and so on. So it's very interesting how often, in the midst of so much deprivation and in the absence of the state, these people feel they've no choice but to work in those conditions. So I try to portray that reality.
And I think it's when you read the book, when I read the book, I think it was the first thing that came to my mind was how can this type of things could be happening in Latin America? So because we need to move our cars, we need to build everything, we need to build buildings. So it's really shocking to see this type of disasters, as you mentioned. Well, we have some questions from the audience that they are asking you, and we still have some time to do that, to answer the questions from the audience. But before we do that, I would ask you, I think, another question. Just one more. So why did you decide to give the title to your book like Guerras del Interior?
Ujú. Bueno, el
Well,
título Guerras del
the
Interior
title,
o
Guerras del Interior, or Wars of the Interior in English,
es un título que
is a
tiene
title that
por lo menos
has at least
dos
two meanings,
significados, o tres significados.
or even three meanings.
El primero de ellos
The
es
first
la
is in the
palabra
word wars,
la palabra guerras refiere,
and
por
that, of
supuesto,
course, refers
a
to
conflictos,
conflicts.
¿no? A conflictos.
And
Muchas veces esos conflictos
often those
no
conflicts
son,
aren't,
digamos,
shall we say, news.
¿no? En mi libro yo cuento un
In my
poco de
book, I talk a bit about the fact
7 de cada
that
10
7
conflictos
out of every 10
sociales
social conflicts in my
son
country
ocasionados
are prompted by
las
the
industrias.
extraction industries.
Conflictos donde
Conflicts where those who
la
usually
mayoría de veces
end up
están
losing
perdiendo la vida, sobre
their
todo,
lives, above all, are
poblaciones
the indigenous populations.
y los líderes ambientales,
And
¿no? Según
environmental leaders, according to a statistic from the organization Global Witness,
el Perú es uno de los
Peru is one of the
más
most
peligrosos
dangerous countries
para
for
los
defenders
defensores del medio
of
ambiente,
the
de la
environment,
tierra y del agua.
of water and land.
En la estadística que yo pongo,
In a figure I include in my book, Global
Global
Witness say that
4
4 environmentalists lose their lives every week globally.
Y eso es una cifra que de
And
verdad
that's a
debería
figure
alertar.
that should really call our attention.
Entonces,
So,
Guerras del Interior
Wars
refiere,
of the
en
Interior
primer lugar, la
talks,
palabra guerra
firstly,
es conflicto.
the word wars, about those conflicts.
Y la palabra interior
And the word interior refers
refiere sobre todo,
primarily
primero,
to
a una
a
zona
geographical
geográfica.
area.
Perú normalmente
In Peru,
todos
we
los
usually
lugares,
call
regiones
all the
que no
regions,
son
apart from the
capitales,
capital,
que no son Lima,
anywhere that's not Lima,
le llaman
the country's interior.
del país, ¿no?
So
Refiere
that
lo que
refers to a geographical zone,
las
the
montañas,
mountains, the jungle.
Pero
But the
también la
word
palabra
interior also
se está
refers
refiriendo
to the
al
interior
interior del ser
of
humano.
the human being,
O sea, que esos
as in
conflictos
these social conflicts,
sociales,
these
ambientales,
environmental
no
conflicts,
que ocurran
don't
primero
first of all
en
happen
las
in the
carreteras bloqueadas,
roadblocks,
en las
the
marchas
protests, the
multitudinarias
huge
que se dan
marches in the
exigiendo los
streets
derechos
demanding our rights or the
de la
protection of the
naturaleza,
environment.
sino que
No,
ocurren primero
first of all, they
dentro de
take place
nosotros.
within us.
Cuando
When we
sentimos
feel that
que ese
that
bosque,
forest,
que
that
ese
river,
río,
that valley,
que ese valle, cuando es
when it's
contaminado,
polluted,
cuando
when
es
it's
destruido,
destroyed,
algo dentro de
something
nosotros
within us
se
breaks.
fractura, ¿no? Ese
That
vínculo
connection with
con la
nature is
naturaleza,
fractured,
¿no? Sobre todo
especially if you're
guerras del
someone who
interior tienen
lives
ese
in that
enfoque.
region.
Entonces,
So,
guerras
Wars of
del
the
interior
Interior is talking
habla
about
de
that.
conflictos que ocurren en el
Conflicts
interior de
taking
nuestra vida,
place in the country's interior,
muchas veces
conflicts that journalism often isn't fully reporting,
pero también
but
refiere
it also
a
refers
aquello
to
que
what
nos
happens
sucede
within
a
us.
nosotros, ¿no? Conflictos por la
Conflicts
identidad,
surrounding
por
identity, around
cómo somos
understanding
peruanos,
who we
cómo
are as
somos
Peruvians,
latinoamericanos.
who we are as Latin Americans.
Ese
That's
es un
sort
poco
of the
el
sense
sentido
I've tried to give it.
que yo he intentado darle, ¿no?
I
Yo me acuerdo
always
de
remember something
una
that the
frase
writer
del escritor
David Foster Wallace
David Foster Wallace
said.
que él
He
decía
said that literature,
decía que la literatura, ¿no? Voy a
I'm
parafrasear, pero decía
paraphrasing,
que la literatura
that literature, above all,
trata sobre todo de
is
entender
trying to understand
cómo somos las
who we
personas,
are as human
qué somos
beings
las
or
personas.
what we are as human beings.
Entonces
And
yo
I
entiendo
understand
la
narrative
creación
journalism
narrativa como una
as
forma
a
de
form of
literatura.
literature.
Entonces, lo que
So,
yo
what I
quiero
aim to do
hacer a
through these
través
stories
de estas historias
is
es
allow
que
us
podamos
to
entender
understand
y
a bit better
cuestionarnos cómo
and
somos
question who we
y
are.
por qué somos
Why are we
indiferentes a
indifferent to
determinadas
these
áreas, que
situations?
nos
To
cuestionemos nuestros
question our privileges.
privilegios, ¿no? Yo
I
mismo
myself have
me he
questioned
cuestionado mis
my
privilegios
privileges
y
and
mi
my
condición,
condition
¿no?
in
De
light of these
periodista,
events.
¿no? Entonces creo
So I think
que el periodismo
journalism
tiene
has
que
to
aspirar
aspire
también a
to
eso,
that as well.
hacernos
Ask
preguntas,
questions,
cuestionarnos
analyze ourselves, reflect
sobre estas
on
ideas
the
que tenemos,
ideas we have
que
about
son,
what progress
el
is,
progreso,
what
qué es el
development
desarrollo,
is,
entre otras
about
cosas.
those issues.
Yeah, and I think your book take us to ask more questions as well. And one, I would start now to read some questions from the audience. They have sent us so many different questions, but I will have to choose some of them because we don't have time to read all of them. But the first one is, what do you think needs to be done to stop the devastation of the Amazon? And I could say not only the Amazon, just the other regions that you have been describing. So is it cutting the demand from the rest of the world to make the exploitation of the Amazon resources less lucrative? Or is it educating those about the value that can be gained by utilizing the Amazon in other ways? For example, tourism, agroforestry, or some other alternative or some other type of projects that could be developed in these regions. That's the question.
Gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you for the question. There's a figure that I include in the book, in the chapter on gold, where I mention that a little over 60% of, round about that figure, of the gold extracted worldwide is used to make jewelry. Over half is used in jewelry making. Then I think around 20%, around 30%, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's close to 40%, I think. Close to 40% is used to make the gold bars that are kept in central banks around the world as financial reserve. And then somewhere around 9–10% is used for industry, for technology, for health, above all for those industries. So think about it. Over half for jewelry, and then for financial reserves. We're saying the bulk of the gold extracted, most of the gold extracted worldwide, is used for things that we don't really need, that aren't vital for human beings. Nobody dies, loses their life, because they don't have a gold ring or a gold earring. So, imagine, for me, gold ends up becoming a metaphor for human vanity. So I believe it's important to think, okay, what are the things that are really necessary? Of course, mining is important for development, for human civilization. It's important. We get many things we do need from that industry. But I think it's important to ask ourselves where that should take place and how. If you're going to do it by imposing your economic model and placing it above the human rights of the populations, that's wrong. It's misguided. It's immoral. Consider Cajamarca, where Maxima Acuna lives, who we've spoken about, for example, is the region that produces the most gold in my country. Yet at the same time, it's the region that has the highest level of poverty. It's a paradox. It's absurd. You'd imagine, okay, if it's the region producing the most gold, it must be the richest region. It should have the least poverty. But that's not the reality. So I think it's important to question and recognize that really this extraction-based neoliberal model is not bringing us the progress and the equity that politicians often want to sell to us. And now we're realizing, through this COVID-19 pandemic, we're realizing that even more. In my country, where we've enjoyed an economic boom over recent years, thanks to metal prices, they were talking about development, about work opportunities, and now that the pandemic's here, we realize that that was in actual fact all an illusion, because the health system's broken, poverty has increased 10% because institutions aren't functioning. Work opportunities have fallen, many businesses are closed, and at one point, Peru was the country with the highest COVID mortality rate worldwide, which is due to the fact that the structures that supposedly should be protecting us often don't exist, or are weakened, broken. So I think it's important for journalism to question that, and that through the stories we write, readers can ask those questions. So think about it. Really, at least for me, in the middle of this pandemic, I've thought a lot about what I really need to live, and I've realized that I don't need too much. Often we live in this cycle of consumerism, and I think despite the tragedy that we're all going through, we should take a moment to stop and think, is it really necessary to live with this consumerist mentality, obsessed with all these things, with buying things? I think the answer is no. I think it's important to consider and find other ways, as the person who asked the question mentioned, to maybe think of other systems that are more environmentally friendly. Tourism is one of them, but not that compulsive tourism, turning everything into merchandise. Trying to build something in partnership with the populations living in that area. I think that's very important.
And have you seen any experiences, where you were working, where you were doing your research? Did you see any like experiences of the communities where they are they have successful ways of organizing themselves, giving their voices, and managing their livelihoods, like without like trying to push to live better without the help of these big corporations?
Some of the stories that I've written over these years talk about positive experiences relating to how to pursue development or progress in their own communities. One of those, for example, is the one I talk about in my book, Edwin Chota. After his murder, unfortunately, it wasn't till then, the state began to pay attention and help the communities and finally give them the titles to their land. And today, as I understand it, the new leaders, now for example there's a very important leader called Diana Rios, a young Ashaninka woman who's doing the same thing, pushing for human rights to be respected in her community under Edwin Chota's example. I understand they're also working on a series of development projects based on a more indigenous perspective, preserving that connection with nature. There's another story I told at one point about Ruth Buendia, who was another Ashaninka leader. She, at one point, when Brazilian company Odebrecht, who were involved in a lot of corruption with Latin American states, you'll have heard of that perhaps, Rosa, tried to build a dam in the middle of a sacred Ashaninka river in the Peruvian jungle. And that would have flooded their land, their farms, and their sacred places. And Ruth Buendia brought together all her people, and they filed a claim to the government. And they pushed until finally they stopped the construction of that dam. And also at the moment, the Ashaninka have organized, in some areas more than others, to produce cocoa, to raise animals, and so on. so trying to build their own development model. And they export many of those products abroad, so they're advancing that way. But the danger's not over, however. We still have the wood trafficking problem and also a very serious drugs trafficking problem, and the link between drugs trafficking and certain terrorist factions that are still in Peru. Just a couple of days ago, for example, in the central valley of the Peruvian jungle, some 6 people were murdered, many of them indigenous people living in that area, because of drugs-related terrorism. So this violence is still there, it's not over. But happily, there is a generation of leaders and activists who are defending the environment, defending the indigenous peoples, like these women, for example, Diana Rios and Ruth Buendia. And I think that's very important to be aware of.
Yeah, that responds one of the questions from the public that says, can you see a positive future for the Amazon? Or do you think that the future is irremediably bleak? So with no future? So, but in some way you have answered this question, but if you would like to add a bit more?
Yes, it's really interesting. I've thought a lot about that as well. Last year, around October, I had the opportunity to write an opinion piece for the New York Times, talking a bit about the future of the Amazon, especially in the context of COVID-19. And I spoke there about the oil spills that have taken place during the first year of the pandemic in the Peruvian jungle. Imagine, from around March to August last year, when we were all under lockdown in our homes, seemingly protected from the virus, there were 8 oil spills in the Peruvian rainforest. So on top of the pandemic, oil spills. On top of the scourge of the virus, environmental pollution. So in my research, I was able to talk to an indigenous leader called Elmer Walinga. He's a 30-something-year-old man, and the work he does is to patrol the area where he lives, the Quechua community is part of the jungle, identifying where there's oil pollution. He's like an environmental monitor. And he told me that since he was a child, he remembers there being oil spills. Sometimes he would go to the river and find fish covered in a strange substance. And often they would eat those fish. And in my research, I came across a horrifying statistic. In the last 20 years, in the Peruvian jungle, there have been almost 500 oil spills. Almost 500. And often we don't think about that. So when I asked him, do you think this situation will change one day for your people? I asked Elmer that. And he told me, yes, I think it will change. But there need to be indigenous governors or representatives in Peru. We need indigenous representatives in politics. Why aren't there more indigenous representatives? And he's right, there aren't any. And I said, when do you think that will happen? When do you think there might be more indigenous representatives in politics who can create laws to defend the indigenous populations? When do you think that will happen? And he said to me something very valid. He said, when the life of an indigenous person and the life of a Westerner are worth the same. And that answer is very powerful, because at the heart of it, that's the real issue. Those of us who live in the city, those who've been educated within the Western context, don't look at the other, at the communities living in the jungles and the mountains, as equals. We often look at them condescendingly, thinking that their way of viewing progress is wrong. So right there, we have a huge obstacle that won't allow us to move forward. An obstacle that is held up by a deep societal racism that we Latin American nations are still suffering from. So I think that is what needs to change for us to be able to conceive of a positive future for the Amazonian populations. Until we change that mentality and look at them as equals, I think there will be a real hurdle to envisaging a possible future. That's what I truly believe.
Fascinating, Joseph. But I need to end this session here. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you about your book. And so for the audience, I'm going to show the book now. And if you are interested in buying this, in purchasing this book, Wars of the Interior, Las Guerras del Interior, you will see the information below in the screen, or you can head direct to Fox Lane Books. Please do it when you have time. And thank you very much. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Rosa, for your kindness. And thank you, Granta, my editorial. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Bye.
Bye.